Hello, my friends, and welcome to Quartet. So nice to have you with us. I'm John Peterson from the Arlington Institute, and we get together like this every couple of weeks, four of us, to have an in-depth conversation about some major issue that's related to this extraordinary change that's happening on this planet. And I'm happy to be joined by my friends, Kingsley Dennis. Hi, Kingsley. How are you?
Hello, John and everyone. Greg Penny. And yes, well, thanks. Greeting you from the winter wonderland of a cold summer UK.
Gregg Braden, how are you?
Hey, I am good. Penny, Kingsley, John, it's great to be with you. I'm learning how to build an ark for all the rain that we have here in the high desert. So, and I'm looking for two of every animal to take with me, just in case.
Good luck. Yeah. Penny Kelly.
Yeah, hi guys. I am talking to you from Southwest Michigan, where it promises to be a real summer day today. 87 degrees, maybe.
And to all of you who are listening and following us, we appreciate it. And thank you for coming and being a part of this. Stay with us here. Today, we're going to talk about some sources about how you get to real truth. Well, let's start as we always do by running around the table and seeing what everybody has on their mind. Penny, what you've been thinking about?
One thing only, and that is two things actually, the rising chaos, the shrillness I hear in everybody's voice. And the other thing, and this is really the main thing, is the killing of millions of animals again and again, birds, cows, pigs, destruction of the food supply. That really bothers me. So that's it.
Greg, what's on your mind?
Well, it's been a month since I've been with you. I was traveling during our last quartet. I missed everyone. So I've got three things on my mind right now. One, just in general, John, I'm not surprised. I'm in awe at how what's happening in Israel is polarizing the world. And it looks like it's going to get worse before it gets better. So I'm watching that closely. The last couple of days, I don't know how our mainstream media isn't picking this up a lot. Looks like we are headed for Cuban Missile Crisis #2. Russian warships are on their way to Cuba right now, but it is obviously in response to what we're doing with NATO and what we're doing in Ukraine. And #3 is the weaponization of our judicial system for political means. I used to think we'd never see that in this country. We're used to seeing it in third world countries, and it's obvious it's playing out in so many ways. And the bottom line is that people in general are just losing faith in all of our institutions. Those three things been on my mind.
Kingsley, what do you think?
Well, I think many things, John, like we all do, and there's a lot to choose from. I think I'll start with, again, some events from my side of the pond, and it's what I would call the election distraction. Because in the EU, European Union, they've just had their EU elections. And perhaps not surprisingly, there was a huge surge in support for the far right parties. In France, Italy, even in Germany, even in Spain, far right parties won the majorities in the EU elections. So there's a lot going on in that election distraction, and again, it's part of the polarization because there's still the narrative about, who's on the left, who's on the right, and, who's going to favor which particular segments of society. If you play in the political field, you're still in the game. And I think it's a worrying distraction, and it's going to get heightened. So that's one. And staying with Europe, this week, the European Union signed a deal to buy up to 40 million doses of an avian flu vaccine for humans. They're preparing for the crossover to humans. And as Penny mentioned, if any one animal allegedly gets infected, they're culling millions. They're not calling it bird flu this time. They're trying to get into a new naming category, avian flu. That's still concerning me, as I mentioned before. So there's the European things on my agenda, John.
Yeah, well, thank you all very much. I'm kind of impressed by a couple of cracks in the system in terms of decisions that have been made by the Supreme Court, the results of some of our elections. There's a rising awareness that's showing up here that's probably driving the shrillness and almost certainly will in the short term at least, generate all kinds of kind of issues as everybody fights the last part of this game going into the election in this country. So thank you all very much. It's time for questions. Melina Halan says, I'd like to know everybody's thoughts on the magnetic excursion. You said aliens will pick up some of us and bring us back to Earth when the Earth is habitable again. I didn't say they will, I said they might. And how will you know if you're selected? Have you had contact or things? Are there things that should prepare for it just in case we're selected to be saved by the aliens? Kingsley, you said in a previous episode that when the sun flares with the solar storm, souls are born. The magnetic excursion is part of the kind of the collapse of the magnetosphere on the Earth, which is the magnetic system that diffuses and deflects the solar wind and that comes from the sun. And so it's thinning, and so that you have less defense against all of those things. Greg, you want to say something?
Sure, John. Melina, it's a good. We've actually got multiple questions in there regarding magnetic fields. If you go to my personal YouTube channel, there is about a 60-minute long video as a geologist where I make the distinction between polar reversals, polar excursions, and polar migration. All of them influence, life on Earth. You're asking about the catastrophic cycles. We appear to be in one of the 12 to 13,000 year cycles that last occurred 12 to 13,000 years ago, another one 13,000 years before that. The magnetic fields are an indication of what's happening under our feet. And what's happening is there are shifts in the inner and the outer core of the planet. I see no evidence that we're going into a polar reversal. I've been challenged on that. There's a lot of new age stuff out there. We're nowhere near the parameters that have to be in place for a reversal. The excursions are much more common, and they are precursors to an increase in volcanic and seismic activity that contribute directly to climate change. And I talk about all that in the video. So the quick answer is yes, we are in one of those cycles. We're overdue for some of those changes, and the magnetic fields are very dynamic, and they are declining, as John said. And it's something that we are keeping an eye on my YouTube channel. Thanks, John.
Yeah, and a lot of this comes from energy coming out of the sun that hits the Earth and then affects these kinds of things. So you need to monitor the sun and all of this. Penny, you got anything there?
Yeah, I would just add that the magnetic fields they're not just our atmosphere and deflect the solar input from the sun. Everything that exists is part of the electromagnetic field system, and that system is what holds us in place. So if that blows away, you can see where we're going.
So, Penny, can you explain whether you're going to get picked up by an alien and just how you get qualified for that?
Okay, there is no course, or there's no what I would call a specific thing that you can do. One of the things that I think is essential is you have to be comfortable with the idea of others. You have to be comfortable being on board ship. You have to be comfortable with the idea of a quick departure. And you have to have, I'll call it, a certain kind of maturity, a certain level of maturity in which you're willing to work with others, a lot of others of a lot of different kinds of people. And we're not very good at that on this planet at this time.
Kingsley, you want to talk about the solar flares generating souls, or?
Yes, I think I referred to it from that question to kind of clear it up. It was a phrase, I was referring to an actual book, and it was called The People of the Secret. I have it here. The People of the Secret by Ernest Scott, a book that I do recommend. And the book talks about there's a demiurgic intelligence, which is a greater intelligence in the cosmos, which is able to, it gets involved in periods of transformation, especially in terms of human evolution on this planet at certain periods. It's not all the time linear. There's accelerated periods. And there was a particular phrase in the book which ties in with the solar storms. The phrase says that when the solar winds blow, there's an increased window for soul making. Now, I think it's a both literal and metaphorical phrase, because what it's saying is that this demiurgic intelligence is also corresponding to cosmic events. So when there's a certain cosmic event, such as when the solar wind blows, and it could be related to solar and cosmic radiation, there's an increased opportunity for transformation on the planet and through people. That phrase was referring to the correspondence between a solar activity and particular opportunities for transformation on the planet.
Thank you. Kathy Adamski then sends another note and some nice comments. Thank you very much. And she asked a question about Gregg, about ET seeking our DNA, and might it be the Holy Grail? What do you think, Gregg?
There is a concerted effort to replace our natural biology with synthetics. There are peer-reviewed scientific papers now that have just come out within the last 6 months or so, literally saying that DNA is a biological resonator. It's an antenna that tunes us to the parts of ourselves that set us apart from other forms of life. And that makes us difficult to control and makes us very powerful beings. We call it divinity, is the term that we give to it. It's our imagination, our creativity, our innovation, empathy, sympathy, compassion, all are linked to the DNA that tunes us to those things. So it is sought after, and it is also recognized as the most empowered. When we embrace the deep truth of what it means to be human and fully express our humanness that our DNA enables, we are very, very powerful, beautiful, sacred beings, and there are forces that would prefer that not happen. So I'll say it that way.
Janine Rickard is back again. Hi, Janine. Fascinating as usual. Why people who are taking care of themselves like herself for decades are sick and suffering. And she wants us to talk more about healing modalities and how we can access them.
I think the basic thing that we have to understand is how toxic the world is. And so all of those things that people are doing, eating right, exercising, avoiding allopathic medicine, the spiritual awakening thing, that's all important, but you have to start with getting rid of parasites, and then you have to get rid of heavy metals, and then you have to clear what I call you have to do some cell wall detox in order that your hormones will work. And that, when you do all that, detox has to become a regular part of everybody's life. And that's just something I learned with Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. The world is too toxic to not be doing detox on a regular basis.
Interesting point. Anybody else on that?
Yeah, I'm just going to chime in really quickly here. And it's a good question. People are asking me the same thing. All the things we've done in the past that worked in the past worked within the context of the world that existed in the past. The world is changing. There's a new world emerging. And if we cannot find, and there's a distinction here. Some people say they're looking for balance. They're not looking for balance. They're looking for harmony. We need to find harmony between our biological system and the emerging world. There are techniques that do that. Heart-brain coherence is a very easy technique. We've got all kinds of videos and instructions on the YouTube channel, or you go to the Institute of Heart Math website. Focused breath and an emotional response. But if we stay locked into a judgment of what we think is good for us, and the world around us is moving in a very, very different direction, it's that conflict that's showing up in biological systems.
That's a nice segue into Diane Ziegler says, I think a war is being waged with frequencies. Smart city installs are happening under our nose and so on. Can't sleep at night. I wonder if these frequencies are likened to the story of frog in the water that is slowly heating up.
Yeah. Oh my. Yeah, we live in a frequency soup. And we're not, I like Gregg's idea there. It's about harmony. You have to harmonize with all of that. You have to find ways and new technologies and gadgets and routines and etc. Time in Mother Nature.
Thank you all for all these questions. Appreciate it. Send some more. We'll talk about it again next time. So it's time for our topic of the day. In the past, we've talked about a number of things related to the whole idea of trying to understand what truth is, right? That here in the middle of all the misinformation and disinformation, and what other the latest variant on information that they're talking about these days. One of the things we have to do, as I just alluded to, is be able to navigate through all of these changes and be able to effectively kind of adjust to what's going on. It's all compounded, of course, by the technology that's coming along, deep fakes and these abilities to where you just cannot understand what's real and what isn't real. Everybody and their brother, every institution that we rely upon is all trying to convince us from their point of view what reality is about in their own way. What I thought we could ask about and talk a little bit about today is what kind of sources are there that can help us to find real truth? Now, this is different than the subject that we had a few issues back, and where we just talked about where do you kind of look for information, and all of it's had different kind of sources. And the question here is more specific to the idea of kind of truth. What are the core kind of key sources that you go to, present company accepted, of course, that you would go to that really seem to have a big high level kind of understanding and concept about what's going on here? Are there different ways to look at what's happening to us? Is there anything certain about what will show up in the coming years? So why don't we start with you, Greg?
So there's three questions here that you asked, John, and each of them has a different answer. I think all this comes down to the way that we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world, the way we've been taught to think, what we call our story. We've talked about this because we solve our problems based upon the way we think of ourselves. We heal our bodies, we choose our politics, we engineer our technology. It's all based on the way we think about ourselves and our relationship to the world. So when you're asking about the two words, you said sources for real truth. Real is an interesting word for us to use in here. I think that I typically look at it on two levels. There are demonstrable, objective events that are unfolding in this reality that we are all subject to. Everywhere from we can look at geologic cycles, magnetic cycles, cosmic cycles, economic cycles, things like that. So those are happening, and when we look at those from a big picture standpoint, a systems perspective, it gives context to what we see happening in our world. I lost my mom to COVID. I think I mentioned that here. Right before she died, I remember she said to me, in the way that she often did, Greg, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. Because to her, it looked like it was coming apart at the seams for no reason. It looked like random, sporadic things all happening at once. She was overwhelmed. She wasn't comfortable living in this world. When we can look at the demonstrable facts of rhythms and cycles in nature, it gives context that it's not coming apart at the seams, and it's not for no apparent reason. But what we're seeing is a breakdown of systems that are unsustainable. And if we can shift our thinking to that perspective, that helps with the context. The next piece, the second piece for me, is how we respond to that context. We're in it. What do we do about it? We are the product of a society that has been taught to hinge our sense of well-being on the world around us. And that is the reason so many people are having problems. The things that they have always felt were certain, from the financial system and retirement and education system to some level of decency in government and security, all of those things are coming apart. For our personal truth, where I think we're being pushed to learn to trust what some people call deep intuition, what scientists are now calling heart intelligence. There's a peer-reviewed article in the Journal of Complementary and Alternative Medicine came out a few years ago. And it literally said, and I'm going to paraphrase this, it said that the physical heart is coupled to a field of energy that is not limited by the classical laws of physics, space, and time. So for me, the best sources for the world that's out there, I still look at the real science, not the pop science, not the politicized science, but I spend a lot of time researching obscure, peer-reviewed scientific journals. They're not always easy to read. They'll tell you pretty much what the real scientists have discovered without a lot of spin on it. They'll tell you what's going on. That's the big picture. Different ways to look at what's happening. I think the shift in what's happening is we're conditioned to see the world as static, and the world is anything but static. So I think that the answer to your second question, different ways to look at what's happening, is to recognize that we're in a dynamic system that is in a time of transition, the end of one cycle, the beginning of the next, and the phase shift that we go through in between. And is there anything certain about what will show up in the years to come? I think what we can be absolutely certain of, John, is everything that we've ever trusted or known to be true is going to be up for grabs. And part of this, John, is by design. And we've talked about this in other programs. There's a systematic effort to dismantle the social structure, social engineering on a scale I've never even imagined before globally, where we break the bonds that have held us together as nations, as societies, as communities, as families, and now within our own sense of self. The last one that is being broken right now is religion. The bonds, our sense of spirituality and religion on a personal level, when everything else falls apart, people have always been able to rely on that. New information is coming up. People are coming out of the woodwork. Some of them, I think, are deep fakes. They're plants. Some of them may be authentic, with texts we've never heard of before, interpretations we've never heard, translations we never heard of, that are throwing doubt and casting shade on that last bastion of sensibility that people have. And now they're finding they have nothing. And I think that's what we can expect is it's called the dark night of the soul, when everything we know, love, and trust, it's what I call the bulldozer of life. It's when the bulldozer of life comes through and levels everything, and then it backs up and does it one more time just to make sure there's nothing standing, and all we have is ourselves. And that's all we need. And I want people to know that's all we need. And we're learning what it means to be fully human. The new world will be based upon the acceptance of who we are and our extraordinary potentials and capabilities, rather than relying on those things in the world around us.
Kingsley, what do you think?
I mean, the way I interpreted your question about the best sources to look for truth is that, again, is to look at the bigger picture, and also in time wise, because, you know, if we just stay in the present moment, we're getting information that's being revealed now, which is, you know, very kind of short term. It's being revealed now. But for me, life on this planet is an open book. And so I feel that a lot of the sources of truth have been left behind as sources to give us information if we know where to look for them. So, you know, I took the example, what we're going through now is a major transition. Have there been any indications of those truths being left behind in certain of these books to read? And we can see that, for example, well, we know in the Hindu cosmology of the Yuga cycles, they've talked about these huge transitions. And what some researchers have noticed is that certain tales and stories have been written at these particular times of transitions. In terms of the Hindu tradition, there's the great book, the Mahabharata. And some Indian scholars have realized that some of the major wars that are depicted in the Mahabharata actually happened time-wise with the transition between certain Yuga cycles. And they say that at the end of cycles, there's a great kind of insanity that sweeps across the planet because there's an energetic recalibration. And when that happens, of course, you get a kind of energy rebalancing. And that's going to affect human emotions and psychology and mentality. So we can see there's been witnesses. Other people who have looked at the timing of Yuga cycles even say that, for example, the great Greek epic, the Iliad, and the Trojan War was written between a descending and ascending arc of the Kali Yuga. Again, it's a dating, but they say these transitions, which is not a transition quickly, they last for decades because you're restabilizing great epochs. And those wars indicate that there's a transitioning. Well, anyone in the future look back at the wars, erupting now in this century can see that as perhaps indicating a transition. If you look at history, again, the collapse of great empires are not just random. And the historian Oswald Spengler says that one indication of these transitionings is a rise, an increase, a noticeable rise in vulgarity in our cultural systems. Well, again, if we look at what's happening on the entertainment stage globally, the music and the films, there's a huge vulgarity there as well. And the British historian Arnold Toynbee said that when we're going through these transitions, you'll notice that because there's a shift in resources. A lot of resources moving to this kind of trying to maintain the status quo, and less resources are put into genuine creativity and betterment of the human condition. And when you get that misbalance, it's shown you going through this transition. Look at mythology. Joseph Campbell, one of the greatest mythologists, I think, depicted these transitions in the metaphor of the hero's journey, in that the major part of it is that you have to go into the underworld and go through the struggles of the underworld and have that trial and error. But the journey isn't finished when you come out of the underworld. The hero has to go back to his community and give the benefits of those struggles to the new generation that can use it for the new epoch. If you don't go back and pass on the knowledge, the hero's journey isn't complete. What will happen will be fractures and cracks in the kind of reality veil, or the veil between dimensions, and certain infrapsychic forces or other dimensional forces will start to come in. You get this intervention between what we have a status quo of reality and what seems outside of our reality. When you get those interventions, it's another indication of these transitional times. In astrology, there's a lot of talk about the correspondence between cosmology and what's happening on the earth. And I mentioned at the beginning about when the cosmic wind blows or the solar wind blows, you get a window of soul making. So I think there's great truths in those long-standing kind of stories that we've had passed down. Because if you pass it down in a story, it protects itself. If you try and tell it directly, it gets attacked by the powers that be. So I think these stories that we have are important. The second part of the question, John, about different ways of looking at it, my particular take on looking at this is that when we go through this time of transition, we need the friction, because if we don't have sufficient friction, we're going to have stagnation or breakdown. Our cars wouldn't move if there were no friction between the wheel and the tires and the ground and the road. That friction creates movement. But also friction is what makes us aware of the opposing forces. Even in the last few years alone, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been so much awakening going on, so much increase in awareness, because that friction has caused it. When there's a period of stability, there's less stimuli to kind of awaken our awareness or to direct our focus. And more people are seeing the necessity to increase the light of the human being, because there's so much darkness being made transparent. And so that darkness performs a function. And, many great wisdom traditions like Rudolf Steiner and George Ivanovich Gurdjieff talked about these frictional forces as necessary, and they come in most strongly when there's needs to impulse on the human condition. So I think those are indications that showing us that we're going through what we've done periodically before, but they're also necessary triggers. And, as I would say, you may see a scorched earth, but from the scorched earth comes a new fertility out of which new seeds will grow, because seeds can get nutrients from the scorched earth to regrow. So that's the way I kind of look at it, that it may seem in the small kind of myopic short-term view, very negative, very destructive, But those destructive forces have always been talked about in our mythologies and our cosmologies as being necessary trigger mechanisms. And in those, I see great truths, John.
Very interesting. Thank you. Penny, what do you think?
Well, I've really wrestled with this whole thing. I think, if I had to make a bottom line statement, the best, hands down, source of truth is the individual. Who have they helped? Who have they hurt? That's the truth of the individual. So that personal truth is always the centerpiece from my point of view. There's a big change coming. Get ready. People's ability to hear that truth is going to depend to what extent have they allowed themselves to refer to their own inner self. So one of the factors of life is that when somebody hears something that is true for them, they will experience this feeling through the whole body of yep. And there's a feeling of almost pleasure. There's a feeling of go for it. There's this deep knowing that's really hard to explain. And so most people will say, well, I think, and maybe they didn't think at all, they felt. But feeling has kind of, over the years, gotten a bad rap. And so people are all into their thinking and, their references, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that is valid, but the bigger piece is what's going on in the human, himself or herself. And are they allowing themselves to recognize truth? When we come into a time and we're really needing to look at what's happening to us, when you don't see what you saw yesterday or what you heard last year or what you grew up believing, that forces a crack in consciousness. It forces perception and consciousness to expand. When that crack starts, it's really difficult to close it again. And so that whole different way of looking at it is that people are being cracked open. Their hearts are breaking, but they're breaking open. Their minds are breaking, but they're breaking open. And so there's nothing certain about what is to come except what the group of us are contributing with our consciousness. Consciousness is the base of everything. Everything is conscious, and it isn't all human consciousness, but we're concerned with the human consciousness that we have, and what are we doing with it? Because we're affecting the whole world, and everybody contributes, everybody. So what, in terms of the real truth, I think what we have to learn to do is recognize that moment when we hear something, and maybe it's just we're overhearing something, and something deep in the self goes, oh, I ought to, and there's a realization there. When that happens, the entire frequency set of the human reorganizes a little bit. That then changes their way of looking at what's happening to us. Now, there are fears that go with that, and there are worries and there are concerns. For all the reasons that Gregg and Kingsley said, we have been taught to look at the world a certain way, and nobody ever said, yoo-hoo, it's all going to change when you're halfway through your life. That isn't the message that we've gotten. And so some people don't want to hear. But once you start looking at what's happening with different eyes, it's really hard to go back. And once you start looking and you have this idea, is there anything certain about what will show up in the coming years? And you realize, no, there is nothing certain. That forces you to open further. And that part of the self that is always watching, always on guard, always perceiving, isn't always conscious, but it's always working. That part of the self begins to become much bigger. And literally, sometimes we build an alternate self to get through difficult times. And that's where I see we're at. I think the best source is you and your consciousness. And I love Kingsley's, what he said last time was that this, when the solar wind changes, souls get born. Immediately I heard that, well, when things change, people are forced to mature. That's the birthing process. We're not, we're not fully born yet until you're mature. And what is maturity? It's when you can make things happen, when you know what you want to happen, and you can use your consciousness to have an impact. That's where maturity, that's where it goes. And that's what we need. And I'm just going to say, we need to, as a group, encourage one another to use that consciousness and respond to one another in that way and band together to have several consciousnesses working together, which we're seeing. I'm seeing that in a lot of places. And that is what creates the new world. So the certainty comes from within, saying, I want that. I'm building that. I'm going this way. I'm not having that. And that is where we're at. I think we're very, very close now to what I'll call the collapse. I think by the end of the summer, it's going to be a high stress time. And when that time comes, go back to yourself. Go back to the deep consciousness, the deep awareness, the deep intuition that everybody has. That's where the truth is found, and you can't fool yourself anymore. So I'll stop there.
Well, I would agree with all of you. Thank you, Penny. And I really agree in the end that this is about finding within yourself the right answer, right? That being sensitive to your intuition and to the sense of yes, that that. And certainly, Kingsley, we need to understand that all these things that are happening about us are this friction that allows us to rise to a new occasion, to a higher occasion. And so I agree with that completely. But I'm kind of this linear engineer, so I'm going to give you a list of things. I think that for me at least, many of the things that the new ideas I get and things are byproducts of what I read and things that I'm exposed to. And that then gives you the opportunity to have that little that says, yeah, that's it, and that works, or that doesn't, or so on. And then you can chain over into other kind of ideas. And so I thought I'd just kind of build a list of the sources that are these kind of high level sources that I think of that have the big picture kind of coherently and internal consistency and so on. And that'll be another perspective on all of this. And I would start with Martin Armstrong. From a conventional point of view, let's do conventional and then move into the weirder stuff. But from a conventional point of view, Martin Armstrong has a interestingly sophisticated program that is built upon the cyclical characteristics of 70 to 75 different aspects of our reality, and how that, in the same way that I think it was Gregg who suggested, you get these cyclical, these long, big ones, small ones, and medium-sized ones that all are happening together. And when you can start to get a synthesis of all of that, then it gives you a sense of what might happen. And so if you are going to approach this just from a conventional point of view, then, you hang your hat on Marty Armstrong, because he talks about the coming Civil War and the global Civil War and the breakup of countries and, the emergence of a new set of countries and so on. And so that's pretty, if you will, sophisticated, conventional kind of assessment. And he's never been wrong. So, I mean, absent anything else, some exogenous wild card kind of thing, which we've got to consider, which he doesn't consider, then you need to go with that. Now, David Icke, it seems to me, is a guy that has got a really big, solid, integrated kind of picture that has, over the years, certainly suggested to me, at least, that he has a unique perspective on how this all works and where it's all going. And so I really like him and his books. I like him and follow him rather closely. Another one is David Hawkins. David Hawkins, who is, you will be familiar with these diagonal shaped covers on his books. David Hawkins is not only a very bright, very thoughtful guy, but he is the designer, the inventor of muscle testing, of kinesiology. And when you're trying to access your intuition, as all of you have alluded to or talked about in one way or another, and you don't know any other way to do it, that is the way to do it. And that is this clear kind of way in which you can get yes, no, these get binary kind of answers for the most part. And I'm telling you, that really works. And that works. I've been to therapists who have used this kind of kinesiology before, and they've worked on rapidly through a set of questions. And they've said to me, well, on September of 1995, something really traumatic happened in your life. And you sat there and said, what in the world? And it took me literally about 3 or 4 minutes and trying to work my way back through my life and said, oh, that's when I had to fold my company and lay off all my people and everything. And that was all down there. And they found that through kinesiology. And so that's really powerful and kind of structural in terms of making sense out of this. I think Mauro Biglino and Paul Wallace are also very important in this kind of term. Paul Wallace, one of his books is Escaping from Eden. Both of these guys have interpreted the Bible, which is so fundamental to kind of Western society and culture, at least, the Bible in dramatically different ways, that says that it is really this animating, this concept that we all grew up with, whether we went to church or not. I mean, it's woven into the fabric of how this Western world works and the ideas and so on. And they're saying, it's nothing like what you've been told. There's no God. There's no nothing. This is about some kind of warlord, some extraterrestrial warlord who's this story about, and particularly in the Old Testament, and about how he was kind of running around trying to consolidate his position. And I mean, it's wild and crazy, but it's a big, big kind of epiphanal kind of notion that is really quite important. And if you're not familiar with it, you ought to take a look at it. There's, as already been mentioned, there's Rudolf Steiner, of course. Steiner has got this big integrated picture from 100 years ago about how the world works in really dramatically different terms than most of us understand on a day-to-day basis. I mean, this is a medium who could see the little spiritual spirits that are the composition of everything is made up of these little spirits. I like to think of my car. At one time, I wrecked my car and was walking away from it, going away. And I just felt it was almost like a pet had died or something. I never had this experience, by the way, before. And I looked back at it, and it was just this connection with this machine that was really qualitatively different than anything else. And I said, there's something real, it's alive in terms that I really didn't understand. And so it tells a big story about what's happening on the planet right now and the evolution of humanity. And so that's good. Dolores Cannon, of course, has got this really sense of gravitas about really knowing how this all works and what it's all about and what's coming and what's going to happen. And so I really like her. I'm a real fan of New Dawn magazine. This is a magazine that a lot of Americans or Westerners maybe are not familiar with because it's published in Australia. Yes, Kingsley is an author there, and I've got an article that I'm working on to try to send out to him. New Dawn is this marvelous kind of current journal that you can that has all kinds of really provocative, unencumbered ideas about how the reality works. I like David Wilcock's books. David Wilcock has done some really interesting research. He's a really good researcher, and I haven't read the latest ones. I've got them, but there are some big, comprehensive kind of ideas in some of what David has done. This is so fundamental and basic to the human experience. And so all of those guys come around to talking about reality and letting you see reality. And then you can access the intuition and say, what is it? What is it? And that really resonates with you. And so that's my contribution.
Everybody presented something a little different, and I really like that. Sometimes we're all on the same page. And, I have this thing left over from school that says you can't copy, even though copying is the way that we learn the easiest, best, and the fastest. So I just want to say thank you, because Gregg's perspective was wonderful. Kingsley, you always amaze me. Oh my God. Just so many good things. And John, I loved your list. I also made a list, but it wasn't anything like your list. My list was like the 46 different news sites and websites that I travel around looking for, feeling for those moments where I go, oh, yeah. But thank you. I loved what you guys said. You always make me think.
That's good.
John, I appreciate you asking the question. And this is an interesting quartet, of course. I think it's vital because I sense within our very near future, we're all going to be faced with an event in the world, and we're going to have to make sense of it. And if we rely on the traditional sources, that is what tears apart families and societies. We have to, and this will force us to go within and to know how to respond. We will all be asked or forced to respond to whatever is happening in the world, and we're going to have to make choices for ourselves. And what I want to say, and we've all alluded to this, we talk about intuition. This doesn't come from the mind. The brain is a polarity organ. And if we try to make those choices from the brain, we're always going to be caught in the ego loops of right and wrong, good and bad, success, failure, healed, sick, whatever it is. The heart is a non-polarity organ with sensory neurites tuned to a field that is not limited by physics. That's where the action is. Thank you for that, John, and Kingsley and Penny for your deep
I'd just like
insights.
to say a short story came to my mind as I listened to you speaking now, both Penny and Gregg. It's about a teacher and his disciple, and they're sitting under a tree having lunch, and the disciple is asking the teacher, what about this? What about this? Tell me this, tell me that. And the teacher is peeling his orange and starting to eat the orange, and the disciple saying, well, give me this and tell me this. And then the teacher turns around and said, would you like a piece of orange? And the disciple says, oh, yes, please, master. So the teacher puts a piece of orange in his mouth, chews it, puts it in his hand and says, well, here you are.
Oh.
And the disciple said, but I didn't expect you to chew it. And the teacher said, well, I thought you was asking me to give you everything else, So it's like, we can't expect someone else to do everything for us. And
Right.
I think everyone's alluded to this. I know Penny and Gregg alluded to it as also, is that when it comes down to it, we have the tools and we have to come through ourselves in this. And I think these are incredible times because we are really finding the resources we have. As I say, the necessity is a mother of invention. When we're pushed against the wall, we'll find out the maturity that we need to be. It's time for us to grow up fast, and that's why we need these trigger points to help us grow up.
Yeah. Well, thank you all very much. Delightful, interesting conversation as always. This is the Arlington Institute, and we hold forth here with a kind of a whole bunch of different kind of programs. We've got one called Transition Talks. We've got a newsletter called Future Edition. You can find out about it all at arlingtoninstitute.org, and we hope that you'll do that. So let's finish up by running around saying, what do you think is going to happen in the next 2 weeks? Penny, what do you think?
Oh, I see an increase in the chaos. I see an increase in the fear level. I think the other thing that I see coming is difficulty, an increasing, we're already there, but increasing difficulty around food prices, getting food. And I'll just say this kind of a wild card thing, but I see big trouble with the pharmaceutical companies.
There's so, I mean, it's everything is kind of like bubbling up. I mean, again, I think I mentioned it at the beginning of the program. I think from the European point of view, there's going to be a lot of attention on elections because of the UK elections. And I think there's a lot of TV narratives are going to get in your face. Something behind the scenes is increasing. So I would say step back from the TV narratives, and keep your center of gravity as they are going to increase in the next weeks ahead.
Good idea. Good suggestions. Greg?
Yeah, I'm right on with everything I'm hearing. Specifics, I think the next 2 weeks, you are going to see Israel mount a major offensive north into Lebanon, and the world is going to turn against Israel in a way that we have never seen since it was formed again in 1948. The political and the social repercussions of that are going to influence our country. Kingsley, I agree. Things happen behind the scenes. There are 68 major banks that are insolvent right now. Those are two specifics. In general, I don't know if it's within 2 weeks exactly. The ground is fertile for something to be presented to the American public for sure, possibly the Western world, that is going to frighten a lot of people. A lot of people will not know how to respond, and we're going to have to determine whether or not what we're being shown is real or if it's fake, if it's some people call it false flag, whatever it is. And there are three different areas where I see something like that. I agree with you, Penny. I think it's going to be by the end of the summer. I think we'll see that.
Yeah, well, I would agree with you, Greg, and I would suggest that you're sitting here in this country, at least, watching all of the efforts to get to Donald Trump. They're going to throw everything against the wall that they can because they're running out of time. And so thank you, all of you, for being with us, and thank all of you who are our viewers for being with us. And we'll look forward to having you next time here on Quartet.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. Love you
Very well.
all.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.